Good afternoon. So I'm Kadam Siddiq, and those who doesn't know me, I'm the director of the UWA Institute of Agriculture and a professor of agriculture here. So it's customary for the University of Western Australia to acknowledge that the university is situated on Noongar land, that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land and continue to practice their values, languages, and beliefs and knowledge. But before we begin, many of you know today marks 20 years since the 2002 barley bombing and the tragic loss of 202 lives, including 88 Australians and 38 Indonesians and many others. Let us briefly pause to pay tribute to the victims and honor the courage shown by survivors and their loved ones and the family members. I am pleased to see some familiar faces in the audience. I would like to acknowledge the Stewart family, friends, and special guests. Professor Tim Colmer, who after a period of time in the acting role was recently announced as the UWA's Senior Deputy Vice Chancellor. Let us congratulate Tim. But Tim is not going to get away. I think he's supposed to throw a party for us some stage. Well done, Tim. The Institute's Industry Advisory Board Chair, Dr. Terry Enright. I'm allowed to say Dr. Terry Enright in meetings while you are in the university. When you are outside, I cannot say that. Yeah, sorry. And Bruce Mullen, board member, supposed to come here, but he's not here. He may join any time. And also, we are expecting Emeritus Professor David Lindsay, Emerita Professor Lynn Abbott, Emeritus Professor Graham Martin, Emeritus Professor Stephen Powles, Professor Ross Kingwell, who works on the other side of the river, but his heart is with UWA. Distinguished guests, UWA colleagues, students, particularly, I love to have more students coming for this kind of events, but those who came, I've been noting particularly my students, because I insist to them that they should attend these kind of lectures. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Western Australia, I wish to warmly welcome you to the 2022 Hector and Andrew Stewart Memorial Lecture. So this year marks the 28th lecture with the inaugural event held in 1996. Of course, last year we could not do because of the COVID restrictions. The lecture is in the honor of late Honorable Hector J Stewart MLC and his son, the late Mr Andrew Stewart, both Wagin wool growers, a country town, those who doesn't know, in the southwest. In 1921, Hector Stewart was elected to represent the southern provinces as a country party member of the Legislative Council. The following year, Hector, together with several of his colleagues, refused to accept an increase to his parliamentary salary, which is really brave. We won't do that at UWA, Tim. In 1923, the money was given to the University of Western Australia and was used in part to establish these memorial lectures. So the money is sitting in a bequest fund, the interest earned is used, so we don't touch the capital. His son, Andrew Stewart, was president of the UWA's Guild of Undergraduates and twice the dean of UWA's then Faculty of Agriculture. As published in the Countryman in 1959, Countryman is a newspaper, a rural newspaper. His students saw him a friend and an advisor, as well as a limitless source of knowledge on all branches of agriculture. This is really a rare combination. The professors and lecturers who can understand the system, then the students come to them and ask questions, and the students are not just about specializing their projects. The Stewart family have continued his devotion to the agriculture education through their strong support of memorial lectureship. In fact, the Stewart family again topped up that bequest fund couple of years ago, and that really helping us to conduct this memorial lecture every year. Hopefully, there won't be any more COVID, second wave or third wave of COVID. As you can see, over the decades, our lectures have explored many topics, from sheep fertility to the war against weeds, and from soil health to global poverty. This year's lecture is particularly special one, as it is the first in our history of this lecture series to be presented by a leading farmer. I'm now very pleased to introduce Ian McClelland to deliver our 2022 lecture exploring the topic Australian Dryland Agriculture, the past, the present, challenges for the future, and of course the opportunities as well. Ian was the inaugural chairman of the Birchip Cropping Group, BCG, which is renowned as one of the Australia's leading farmer-owned research group. We had UWA, particularly some of us had a significant input in the early days, and that's how I met Ian nearly 27 years ago. Since then, Ian has been a very close friend of mine, and we argued many times, particularly with his wife, Anne, who is a teacher, and we argue all night long, various things, including farming. Ian probably will elaborate that in his speech. In his role as a chairman and board member, Ian has traveled extensively, representing the group both nationally, internationally, to a wide range of audiences. I remember one of the trips I took Ian and half a dozen or maybe more farmers. We traveled first to Thailand, from there went to New Delhi, then to Mumbai, then ended up in Karachi and also in Islamabad. I said, you are not going to take any alcohol to Pakistan, but they did sneak in. And then I said, I will watch the room. No one is coming into the hotel. Then they had a couple of good whiskey there. But more importantly, we went to Bangladesh, Dhaka, and then went to Chittagong, the port city. This is not in the notes you have prepared. And we went to a lift, and these farmers, some of them, particularly John and others, very heavy farmers, I said, we are not going to get into this lift. They said, yes, we'll do anything we like. Guess what? The lift completely fell off, and dark and claustrophobic, and people have to come and rescue us from that. He has also chaired the Grain Research and Development Corporation's Managing Climate Variability program from 2010 to present, and is an honorary senior fellow of the Institute of Land and Food Resources, Crop Protection at the University of Melbourne. So he's an agriculture graduate from Melbourne University, number of years junior to our famous Vice Chancellor, Alan Robson. Mm-hmm. So he's really knowledgeable about agriculture, science, and the Birchip Group really is an emergence of no one wants to care the Birchip. Birchip is in a triangle where no one wants to care. So the Victorian Department of Agriculture refused to come and do work there, and the farmers got together. They came to Western Australia. At that time, we already started the early days of the Grower Group Alliance, including Mingini Irwin Group. Later on, the Libby Group started. So they came here, and that's how the connection with Western Australia and UWA occurred. Ian and his family run 8,300 hectare farm, producing wheat, barley, canola, lentil, and hay and vetch. So he will talk about how he started lentil in his talk. I won't steal that. And supporting the merino sheep. His interest lies in agriculture education, research, and is dedicated to practical on-farm applications. Ian is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Hugh Mackay Innovation Award, Medal of the Order of Australia, Centenary Medal awarded by the University of Melbourne. 2004, he received the prestigious GRDC Seed of Light Award in recognition of outstanding research communication in the southern grain region. So please welcome Ian. I also would like to, Ian and his group produced the Birchip Cropping Group the first 30 years. So when he gave me this book, I said, am I in the book? He said, yes, I am in the book, but I haven't seen it yet.
Must have been that other copy. Thank you, Sadiq, for those kind words, and it's a pleasure to be here. And it's only because of the group that Sadiq has become a very good friend, and always interested to know how he does what he does with his energy and obsession, and he really put pulses on the map in our part of the world. I want to start by just very quickly saying about the BCG is that, which will be part of my talk tonight about some of the outcomes. That, you know, we've been 30 years and we have 20 staff doing research, and our mission is to improve prosperity of broadacre farmers through applied science-based research and extension. Now, what we really want to be is part of the agricultural community. The agricultural community between the scientists, the industry people, and the farmers, so they can interact together for the benefit of everyone. And that's really been the basic aim of our group from the beginning. And it's finished up having some great friends and contacts. Steve up there has been there, and yeah, so it's been a real pleasure to be part of it. So what I want to talk about today is agriculture in Australia going through a boom, or is it just a cycle, another cycle? Or are we in a new time of sustained prosperity for farmers? And the other thing I'd like to talk about is why are crop yields increasing so much at the moment compared to the past? There's been a sustained increase in crop yields in most grain-growing regions, and I'm going to try to answer that question for you tonight. Most areas in Australia have had 3 pretty good years. I think West Australia might have had 4, some too good, I might add. Price of commodities have been very good. Interest rates have been very low. Ukraine wars helped create scarcity, energy shortages. And there have been droughts in other countries, and there's food prices all around the world have been high. So it's been a fantastic number of outcomes which has helped commodity prices. Good seasons, good prices, good profits, basically. So this has been represented by the fact that land prices across the country have risen incredibly high. In our part of the world, 2 or 3 times the price over the last 2 or 3 years. There's been land sold at Horsham, nice black country down there, on a 500 mil rainfall for $35,000 a hectare. And quite a few paddocks have been sold at that. No improvements, just a nice paddock. And that's been typical of the land prices, not only in Victoria, but in West Australia and across the country. And yeah, have yourself, ask, are they associated with productive value, or is it just people speculating? On an aside, this is going to really have huge problems for succession family plans for the future, depending on your point of view of who should get the farm. So, as well as farmers buying these lands, there's been a huge increase in investment by super funds. Go Farm, all these consultants now are buying, these groups are now buying huge tracts of land. The entrepreneurs are really getting into land. And why are they getting into land? Is it because of capital gain thereafter, or productivity? But once financial people would never go for rural land lease. It was far too risky. But now there's a huge investment by the multinationals into agriculture. The Australian Farmers Federation predicted that Australia production was going to be $100 billion by 2030. At the moment, this year, it's gone past $70 billion. So the production, they're on track to meet this challenge. West Australian production has probably doubled in the last 10 years. I mean, it's been out. I can remember coming to West Australia and say, we hope to get 12 million tonnes, and they were skiting. And now they're, what's 25? Yeah, 40, 34, yeah. 24 million tonnes. So, I mean, West Australia are just showing that the yields and their farming methods or the seasons have done amazing things. Now, that on one side of the ledger, when you actually think about climate change, if climate change, how it's going to affect farmers. If we think about the droughts that have, or the evidence about, I know one drought doesn't make but if we think about Northwestern America's had this huge drought, Canada's had a drought last year, Europe's had droughts, there's been heat stress last year in India, which reduced their pulse crop, fortunately. And Europe's hotter than it's ever been. I was in Paris 3 years ago when the temperature had its record 43 degrees. It wasn't quite Gay Paris that day. There have been floods in Pakistan. A third of the country is underwater. A third of the country is underwater. I read today that they need to rebuild 2 billion homes in Pakistan. Bangladesh, well, it's normally floods every year, but today I read that South Sudan's suddenly underwater. We've had fires in Europe and America. I think California's had them every year for the last 5 years. And in Australia, I don't need to tell you about floods, fires, you know where they've been. So you could say that the bulk of that evidence suggests that climate change is something related to the climate for the future. So they say that climate change will result in temperatures increasing, rainfall being more variable, and possibly rainfall decreasing. Climate more variable, and yet farmers are still optimistic. So we should expect our turn will come soon. What will it be? Will it be floods, fire, drought, heat stress, frosts, winds, or something else? Maybe disease. Yet we remain optimistic. It's good, isn't it, how resilient we are in relation to that concept. On our farm, for instance, we are keeping 2 years of feed for our livestock and put them into containment areas where we can put all our sheep into containment areas when there's no feed in the paddocks or that we think there could be a sustained drought. I actually think that 3 things are making our farms more sustainable. One is the science of farming. The second is, and the technology that's being developed. And thirdly, I think that farmers are being more educated, and that's a crucial factor in this success factor of farming. So I want to talk about some of the major breakthroughs that happened in the past and finally some of the challenges of the future. Now I could start with the first major challenges in the early 1900s. Was it Farrer's Federation wheat, or was it superphosphate that was developed in the early 1900s? And it was so important that the federal government had a subsidy that lasted probably 50 years. I heard tonight that you could buy superphosphate for £8 in the middle of a tonne in the middle of the 60s. So it certainly, the federal government decided how important something like superphosphate was. Okay, so I just want to start talking about some of the innovations that have happened in agriculture over the last 20 years. And the first one, I think the biggest innovation that's probably happened is farming with no-till. Some farmers in our area used to cultivate their land up to a dozen times before they sowed their crop. I mean, imagine how the organic carbon was reduced. So in more than 20 years, we probably should think about, have our soils got any better under direct drilling than they were before? And you've got to remember that to do direct drilling, we had to have chemicals, so herbicides. So you could not have one without the other, and how important that was. So how significant was direct drilling to our soils and basically the fertility of our country? Now, I believe that they have, and there's some proof that they continue to improve, certainly stopped erosion of the paddocks in those early days, particularly in a country like the Northern Mallee, the sandy country. I think it improved soil structure, infiltration, and the organic matter of straw being put back into the soil, that get back in the soil, has either caused increase in carbon or in nitrates. In our local area, when I was a kid, in the sodic plain of Birchip, you couldn't grow anything, really. Now, with the addition of gypsum and putting back all this organic matter into soil, there's been an amazing change. The country is as good as any of the other country around. So I think no-till system is certainly now making our country far more resilient. The second one is the fertiliser management. We do soil tests, we do test strips, we do satellite imagery, we do all sorts of things, and then we put our nitrogen management through things like yield profit. There's a new thing called the nitrogen bank, which now people are thinking about and undertaking. And still, nitrogen management is still not very well done. This year, for instance, we are probably under, even though our yield's probably best ever, still undermanaged. Phosphorus tests, and there's two types of phosphorus tests, so I think farmers are pretty well up to date with that. So I think fertilisers, we're getting so much better at fertiliser management, but I still think that we did in the WIMRA that apart from water, the biggest limitation of profitability of WIMRA farmers were the fact they weren't putting enough nitrogen on their paddocks. The third thing was just the data processing. The huge collection of data, satellite maps, yield maps, protein maps, variable rate technology. You can have 100 paddocks in one paddock now. And you can just decide in your office how you want to treat it, put the disc back in a tractor, and it happens automatically. I mean, wonderful capacity to innovate with the technology that's happened. And not only inside the computer and your tractor or harvester, but I mean, we just bought a harvester that's self-adjusting. I mean, you could put anyone on the header because it self-adjusts, where it was such a skill once to adjust the header. Machinery, amazing changes happened, not only GPS and precision agriculture, but the scale of the machines, precision of placing seeds accurately in absolutely the right spot, and the reliability of the machinery is becoming increasingly, and this all adds to the timing of the operation, because being able to sow your crops and to do your jobs on time or quickly is crucial to this modern agriculture. And the machines have really made a difference, a considerable difference in the last 10 years. For livestock, I actually would think that the advancement of electronic ear tags has been a huge advantage for the sheep farmer. No sheep can escape being barren, lost a lamb, wool quality, wool weight, meat weight. All these things can be stored and treated properly. The containment area, which is a very simple model, is such a good option for sheep farmers in that it protects the soil. Instead of selling sheep, you can now decide to keep your sheep if you prepare properly. And now pasture management is, we sow pastures every year on our country that's not going to be cropped, and it works pretty well. I think the other great, which I've sort of mentioned before, is just the choice of varieties you can do now in agriculture. We used to be wheat, barley, oats. Now the Pulse program has just added so much benefit to our rotations for putting nitrogen back in the soil, and also a different income. Canola has been such a huge increase in canola across the country. This year there's lentil crops which are going to probably yield 3 tonnes per hectare, which is, we couldn't have dreamt about that 30 years ago. And I have to give great credit to the lentil breeders who have developed varieties taller and far better. Sadiq, he came down and as he came up the drive for the first time I met him, he looked at our country and says, "You grow lentils." And like everyone else in this room, we wouldn't dare not to. And they're now incredibly mainstream. In fact, one of my relatives, who's quite a big farmer in the area, said he now feels confident of the productivity of his farm because he now thinks he can grow lentils. He believes he can grow lentils. He just didn't do them as a guess once, but he now thinks he can do them. And the value of vetch in terms of pastures and recycling nitrogen and for hay has been incredibly important. We're now getting into winter wheats as well as spring wheats for the option of being able to sow very early. In fact, and being able to graze those crops during the winter has been good. Farmer education now. BCG, we spend 1/3 of our money that we get on extension because we believe how important it is. All farmers have got to have lifelong learning. They've got to belong to discussion groups, seminars, field days, talk to their neighbours, but they need to know about innovation. They need to always be thinking about what's next. And it is the sleeper of all this agricultural production is how good are the farmers that are actually doing the job. I know most farmers have consultants. Nearly every farmer has a consultant, agronomic consultant. But there's marketing. We have marketing consultants, both wool and grains. Obviously, we have financial consultants and lawyers, and so there's the consultancy business is still, it's probably expanding in the country. Now, spray technology is the other important increase that's happened in Victoria, and I think we need to get into our head. It's safe if you use it safely, and I think a lot of the discussion about herbicides has been the fact that it hasn't been used safely, and I think that farmers, they had a survey in the paper the other day where they've been testing farms around the world, and Australian farmers had the lowest amount of Roundup in their bodies than any other farmers. So they're obviously putting on their masks and their gloves, getting in their cabins, because everything's poisonous. You eat salt or alcohol too much, it'll kill you. Particularly the latter. The other one, which you might think it's dear to my heart, is weather forecasting, and I actually think that the 7-day weather forecast has been incredibly accurate. This is the BOM one, and I think it's made day-to-day operations really important. And seasonal forecasts, and I have spent a fair bit of time with the BOM, and they now access to model, they say, is 72% accurate, which is, if you went into a casino and you had 72% of the chance, you'd probably make a lot of money. So, but I think climate forecasting is going to be a help in the future. It isn't at the present, and I think that's something that has made a contribution. Okay, so that's why I believe that agriculture is pretty sustainable in the future, and I think we have a very bright future. Obviously, we'll get droughts and we'll get frosts and we'll get things which will put us off for a while, but we'll have the resilience, and when things are good, they'll be really good again. And so we all should feel very confident about our agricultural industry. So if I talk a little bit about the future, strangely enough, this is one of my first things about the future. Farmers have got to get closer to the consumer. Now, I don't know whether you've seen in the Guardian Australia, they've had this bloody article for the last 2 weeks about the crazy farmer who didn't want any people coming in taking photographs in his canola crop. Now, because he says it's against, safety for animals. Well, how many animals are in canola crops, I'll ask you. But, I mean, he should have had a sign saying, come and take a photograph and I'll have a talk to you at the same time. Because I think we have to really sell ourselves to the consumer. But we also have to prove safety of food, the traceability, the accreditation of our food, and promote it. I mean, on our farm, we have hang gliders that come up, and they've come up to our paddock. We have a 600-acre paddock, and for 30 years they've come up, dozens of them, and they're taken off and they catch the thermals and they travel around the country. But some of those guys are now some of my best friends. They're always asking how the farm's going. And I've also had Chinese tourists stopping when I'm moving sheep and having a chat in the road. And I mean, I think we just need to be really serious about selling ourselves. And there are a lot of things happening on the internet. There are a lot of people now telling their story on Facebook and TikTok and blogs and Twitter. And I think that's good. I mean, I think we need to continue that as much as we can, because I think food safety, perception of food safety, is going to be an issue for a long time in the future. I think the other big challenge is going to be our carbon footprint. farmers are going to have to be accountable for the greenhouse gases. And I've split it into two areas. One is on the farm and the other one is in our inputs. So we've had quite a lot of discussions with CSIRO and Melbourne University about, and we actually did a trial based on Clive Kirkby's CSIRO work over 5 sites trying to make carbon in the soil, and was completely unsuccessful. Clive Kirkby did one thing different. After he put all the nutrients in and did everything right, he then rotary hoed it all back into the soil. He was able to do it that way. But we're not into rotary hoeing. So I think a few things, if I had to summarise carbon sequestration, carbon sequestration is difficult to achieve. Let's just be frank about it. You probably need a minimum of 12 to 20 years to really make a difference. You need high levels of nutrition applied to achieve. So you really have got to put a whole lot of N, P and K in to make carbon. The other thing is, the higher the rainfall, greater the chance of achieving this. Lower the rainfall, you'll lose it more. According to Richard Eckard of Melbourne University, grazing only situations are the most likely to achieve in terms of high rainfall, grazing only country, you can achieve certainly that. But in the grains industry, it's very difficult. And the other thing he said is, however, even if you achieve some carbon sequestration, it can all disappear in 1 year. And they're not quite sure why, whether it's heat and water, but it can all disappear. Now, he says, beware of carbon credits. The clever people are not selling. They're keeping it just in case we need to demonstrate for production. Now, on our farm, we've taken a whole lot of carbon soil samples and we just put them in the cellar and we'll think about it 20 years' time. But we've taken tried to do a baseline so that ever we have to prove it. And Clive's also said, Richard Eckard always said, there's a sampling error of 20%. There's an error of 20% and 10% in the testing in the lab. So there's basically a 30% if you take a sample. It's possibly 30% out. Now, I've got a neighbour who's a little bit alternative, and I went over to see something in his feedlot the other day, and he said, I'm just getting carbon credits. I said, really? That's fantastic. He said, I've just got 0.25% increase in carbon credits in 6 months. Well done. I said, did they test the soil in the same spot every time? Oh no, they just randomly tested. And and he got $45,000 put into his account. And I spoke to Richard Eckard, and I said, this is a scam. I mean, and he said, yeah. So carbon credits is a very interesting, I don't know who accredits all these schemes, but it's a problem. But we'll still have to keep working at this whole problem of sequestration. But I don't think we have a huge handle on it yet. The other one is farm inputs. Now, the information I get is that in farm inputs, fertiliser makes up 20% of the greenhouse gases. Grazing systems make up 21%. and crop residues 27% and leaching 17%. Now, in terms of urea, I think there's some very interesting things happening in relation to making hydrogen. I see Forest in today's Western Australians wants to set up an $80 million place to produce hydrogen and then to produce electrolysis to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turn it into ammonia, which is sort of at the basis of urea. And I think the system's called a Harvard-Bosch program, but we hope that something like this is going to really happen, and I think there's a plant starting in South Australia. So this is, a real option for us to help this thing happen, that we can reduce our urea carbon footprint. Grazing systems, well, we've all heard about methane and about the yellow seedweed, both in West Australia and South Australia, and we hope that this actually works and it's taken out. I think it's achievable. I think we will all be happy to feed our animals a lick with yellow seaweed in it. And I see Mrs Hearn in New Zealand is just putting a tax on methane, which was announced yesterday. So it's probably coming. So let's hope we can do it before that happens. And the other one is, I think they're putting polymer coating on fertilisers, which also helps. The other one in relation to challenge is, my son who's in PR says, Dad, artificial meats from plant proteins are going to really input on our future. And he could well be right, maybe not quickly, but it's going to be a threat to the meat industry and probably good for the pulse industry. Okay, the next one is climate change. Climate change is going to produce great extremes, and we're going to have greater flexibility, and we're all going to be more strategic, and we'll probably rely on greater predictions to actually help us make better decisions. And we get back to the bomb, how good are they? And I know a lot of people don't like them, but including a very good friend of mine. Things like sowing earlier, different crop ranges, moisture conservation. I wrote down horses for courses. It's not about horses, but just trying to do things relevant to the situation. I used to be an old farmer in Birchip that used to always say, don't fight the season, go with it, which I thought was wise of him. If things are bad, don't say, well, bugger it, it's going to have a good year. And I think there's a thing in that. Now, the next one is data cooperatives. Some people spend their lives on this data thing in research, and they're just obsessed with it. And sure, there'll be greater data collection, and they'll get into benchmarking, and they're wanting data cooperatives, and it's virtually got to be automated data collection, because you get sick of putting it all in yourself month after month. So somehow it's got to be automated data collection. And it comes, and then you can do things like machine learning and some of these other fancy things that they're talking. But I think the data co-ops or data information technology is still going to make a big future difference in our farming. Technology dominating our every move. Well, just think of how the telephone dominates our lives now. We can't do anything without the telephone. This will include machines, processes, movements, machines without drivers. There'll be robots. There'll be all sorts of new technologies which will make our farming different, or better, or easier, or more complicated. I was in Germany, and Mr Horsch, who was a manufacturer, showed us this spray technology where the spray unit goes on a low trailer and gets it off, and goes and does a whole paddock on itself, and comes back and puts it on. Someone said, "How do you have trouble putting that thing back on the machine, on the trailer?" And he said, "Well, just get your 6-year-old to do it. He'll probably fix it for you." He's probably right. I think there's going to be a lot of changes in our power supply. I expect we'll all have an electric car in the next 10 years, or electric ute, and I think that will happen, even though we probably don't believe it at the moment. But there's always going to be new innovations in pesticides or herbicides and insecticides, capability, so there'll be all sorts of new products. Now, there was a statement which said, there's life after cultivation. That's strict drilling. And I suppose I asked the question, is there life after herbicides or chemicals? I don't know whether there's an answer to that, but it's a nice one to think about. Now, my good friend Hon Rees is in Europe on a GRDC travel scholarship to study farming without Roundup. He's been to Europe and Canada and Argentina, and it turned out to be not only Roundup but a whole lot of other chemicals as well, of which one of them was, for instance, a lot of farmers said they no longer can grow canola because of some little insect that they're not allowed to kill, so they're giving up canola. So there's always going to be increases in that. I'd like to say a couple of things about regenerative agriculture. I've read my son thinks we're regenerative agriculture. We do everything scientific. So he says we're regenerative, but on the left of that, Charles Massey's book, on, where he says that get out of the way and let nature cure itself, and a lot of supporters of that. I find it's hard to handle. It goes against most of the good things science have had to offer. I sort of think it's a pipe dream. I quite like their rotational grazing stuff, but really, in fact, I get insulted by the fact he calls us the industrial farmers instead of the scientific farmers. You know, I think we do things in a scientific way, where he calls us the industrial farmers. That must be bad. I think we're all, in the future, our environmental responsibility is going to increase. So we're going to have to be accountable for our environment. And I think we should do it because we live there. Not many businesses where the owner lives on the factory floor, where farmers live on the factory floor, most of them, and most of them quite like to have a nice home and garden and things, but I think we should link this to our living environment and protect and try to, to protect plants and animals. We used to have a theme which is making conservation pay. In other words, try to find ways where conservation could help you instead of be something it doesn't. Now, I am absolutely believe that part of the future is we have to make environments where people want to live. We want good farmers. We've got to make them want to live there. If you can get them to live there, they'll be good farmers if they're happy living there. And I think we always have to have the back of our minds, we need communities where people want to live, and how do you do that? So you have to create an environment where people want to, when you're in a really good community where people get along and you live in a great environment, that in Massachusetts in America, all the wealthy people live there and all the clever people live there because it's beautiful. It's a lovely place to live. Who'd want to live anywhere else? So, I mean, we should adopt that same attitude. Try to create our area which is, whether it's water, trees, but landscape, but it's so important that we develop a community and environment that people want to live. And the other thing is, don't be scared to brainwash your kids as well. Nearly finished. There's been some work done about yield gap between the theoretical potential and the actual. And there's quite a lot of farmers at the 80% yield potential, which is probably as far as you want to go because of the things vary after that. But there still is some way to go for some people to farmers to innovate, to try to increase their yield gap between potential and actual. I'm just going to get into it. Oh no, the other one is I think farmers, the farming community, we don't pay our labour enough. I think that you pay peanuts, you get monkeys, and that if you consider most dryland farmers now have got machines that you really don't need the labour that you once had, maybe for short periods. So as a percentage of farm income, our labour component is much less than it has been in the past. So we should put it into getting the best, and I think that it would be a great boon for the agricultural area if people wanted to work on farms because they made money and they enjoy it. Couple of crazy ones in terms of the future. I spoke to Sadiq about this before. Will we sell protein instead of tons of lentils in the future? And he says not yet because they don't pay us on lentils, but protein. But there's a huge new industry happening with processed protein, and it's expanding rapidly for manufactured food. So that's something to think about. There's also continuous improvements in all sciences that I've mentioned before. All those people are doing great things. Now, two of my final ones is BCG. We spent a few years putting polymers on crops, where it's like growing a plant in a bottle. We cover it with a polymer, and it grows, and the transpiration turns into water and goes back in the soil, and you do it over and over and over again. It sort of worked, except it was pretty. The polymers blew away, and we gave it up after about 5 years doing all this work on polymers. And the other night I spoke to Andrew Wiedemann, and he said, "Hey, your polymers are going to get another run." And he said, well, I said, "How come?" He says, "We're going to put them through a boom spray." So something to look for, where you better put a polymer over a crop and conserve the moisture. And finally, this is one that I think is just long term. I think science will eventually get to the stage where energy will become very cheap, and we'll be having to think of ways to use it. And I think maybe not in my lifetime, but I think the challenge will be what can we do with energy to, in the agricultural sector, we can do it now through glasshouses and desalination of water and all those things. So that's about it. Thank you.
So we'll take some questions. Please be brief and also say who you are and just sharp questions and then brief answers, please. Yeah. Who wants to go first? Peter Nelson and then Ross Kingwell.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Ian, have you got any thoughts on population growth?
Yes. I mean, I think the new way I think about population is the better economic circumstance, the less population. So in a sense, it's our responsibility to grow as much food as we can so some of these countries can become more economically dependent. But yeah, 9 billion by 2050. So yeah, it's going to be interesting.
It worries me if you're going 1 billion by year 1800.
Yeah.
9 billion.
Actually, I wrote down here that I always thought starvation was due to affordability, logistics, and being able to get to them.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm now starting to think that because of climate variability, that food security is going to become far more of an issue than it has been in the past. Not just because of the Ukraine war, but I think that there's going to be times when things really are tough, particularly for the underdeveloped countries, where it's food itself will be a problem, not so much just all the other things.
Ross Kingwell.
Yeah, just following on, Ian, I enjoyed your talk very much. Your last comment, I think, is really interesting, where you think through what are the implications of much lower cost of energy. And I think of our WA wheat belt, where we cleared our deep-rooted perennials and we've had rising water tables. So we have a lot of water sitting in our profiles that if you could convert that through accessing cheap energy into a water resource to underpin and supplement our dryland agriculture, and combine that with the low cost of transport, which again could be underpinned by a low cost of energy. So I think the future of agriculture in a low cost of energy environment is really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes you've got to put your mind in reverse, or change one thing in the world and say, what happens if we've got too much water? Or what happens if we've got energy for nothing? I mean, those sort of things often create your lateral thinking into new ideas, maybe. I mean, I always thought that, already in South Australia, the tomatoes down in the York Peninsula, where they desal water, they got glass houses, they have air conditioners, they have heaters, and sell tomatoes to Coles all around Australia. I mean, it's a lovely thought. Mm. I mean, I think Sue could answer this question far better than I could.
You tell first.
So, I think that we do understand that the better the yield, the lower the nitrogen that goes back in the soil. Yeah, and that probably on a 3-ton lentil crop, we probably don't put anything back in. But probably a 3-ton lentil crop probably puts nothing back in. So in a drought, we say, good, we've got all this nitrogen back in. What do you think, Sue?
Yeah, I don't want to have an argument today, but but a thumb rule is that if you got good biomass from a legume crop, yes, agree that you remove quite a lot by the grain, but still significant amount of root biomass and things. So we're saying that a lot of studies shows that if you have got a good legume with respectable yield, grain legume, you can get equivalent to 500 kilogram, half a ton of extra yield plus 2% protein in the wheat crop. So it's equivalent to probably 40 to 60 kilograms of nitrogen otherwise you would have applied if it is wheat, etc. There is, and all depends upon the crop. So in a dry year, perhaps the amount of nitrogen will be less because the growth is less, the bacteria doesn't work. But your lentil crop should be less than faba bean and things because they don't have a lot of biomass. But he still haven't given me any money for the 1,500 hectare lentil he grew the first year, which I was very surprised because just believed me and put 1,500 hectare lentils. But that's dangerous because a scientist can say whatever because I'm not investing the money, but he's a brave farmer.
Well, back to the livestock side of things. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, back to the livestock side of things. We've done a fair bit on cropping. Very important. But the confinement feeding, this is something I did speak at Birchip, and it's still very dear to my heart because I think it is a really valuable tool in the mixed farming enterprise. But one of the things that's always concerned me is how do we get those nutrients out again from that concentration of those livestock over that small area. And in Western Australia, it could be up to 6 months with 6,000 ewes in confinement.
Yeah, we've had them in for that long. Well, I suppose, I mean, you could do it like pig industry and spread it, but in fact, I don't think there's been a lot of research done of how much nutrients were returned to the soil with in the paddock. I mean, I've wanted a lot. I mean, around dams and water troughs, you see a little bit of an increase, but not dramatic. So, I mean, I think that's be a good research project.
Okay, we'll take
to
it
see
on
how
board.
much urea, how much nitrogen is put back in the soil with grazing.
Well, there is the part of the carbon as well, because if you just assume an animal's eating a kilo of dry matter a day, it's mainly straw, which is what is a large part of the time, and so it's 40% indigestible, and that's 40% carbon.
I'm not sure it doesn't volatilise though.
A lot of that carbon would probably volatilise out of the system. So this is one of our problems, isn't it? Getting that carbon in the stable form.
Getting into soil.
Yeah.
Any other questions? John Hamblin in the back, please.
Ian, how do you see us solving the phosphorus problem where we know there's a finite resource? I see nitrogen as a trivial problem in comparison. All we need is energy. But phosphorus is going to be a really severe limitation.
You know the easiest way of doing it? Just raise the pH, raise the acidity. And that's pretty hard. But you're right, yes. I mean, I think we'll be probably taking all the urine out of cities now and turning it back into phosphate in the paddocks. And, you know, I think we have to be creative and try to recycle it somehow.
But also the crop diversification and rotation, solubilizing the soil-bound phosphate because the huge bank of phosphate already for the last 150 years into the soil, and that's another way of looking. Then optimization of the amount of phosphorus used, then phosphorus use efficient crops we need to use in the future. Yeah.
Interesting that there's been my grandfather selected our place in 1895, and he grew about 8 good crops, and it suddenly hit the wall, and it was phosphorus. There were quite a few organic farmers suddenly decided in the 70s when it was popular, to grow, including a share farmer of ours, and didn't put phosphorus on for about 5 or 7 years. Yields collapsed, completely collapsed. So we know it's incredibly important. You don't need heaps, but you do. It is incredibly important.
All right. So thank you, Ian. So would you please join me in thanking summarize, but the key observation is that we really had the combination of a scientist, probably coming from your father's training, but also the Melbourne University training, and then the experience of a clear farmer. So it's a mixed cropping and livestock, early development, very good knowledge about the soils, the crop diversification, then the new technology, and of course, Ian's son Tim is now taken over. He's another graduate from Melbourne University. So they do practice science, and it is good that ending that not industry farmer, science-oriented farmer. I think that's what the Australian agriculture is about. But Ian then touched upon the food industry. So I was doing some reading, and we're talking about $200+ billion worth of food industry. So the politicians doesn't just look at, so okay, we have $45, $50 billion of exporting, and we reach the total value of $100 billion. But the enormous potential in transforming Australian agriculture and food industry for us, but also significant number of people overseas. So the wine industry has done well, $100 million 20 years ago. Now we're talking close to $3 billion worth, and every day 24.6 million glasses of Australian wine is consumed, both here and Australia. So enormous opportunities, especially for the young people. The other thing I saw is that the Birchip Group bringing those school kids and others, enormous. What a wonderful shot that. I think we need to do that more in Western Australia. We have a grower group alliance, which really facilitate 60 grower groups in the state, from small number of farmers to as high as 1,500. So there are some very robust grower groups in Australia, and many of them are not here today because they're very active season at the moment. So once again, thank you, Ian, for coming all the way from Birchip and spending time with us. I'm pleased to share that, Rosanna told that today's lecture has been recorded in full. Hopefully people can listen, because one complaint was that people could not listen to the previous recording. So some problem with the recording. The video will be uploaded to the UWA Institute of Agriculture YouTube account by end of this week. Normally I thought you do it by tomorrow. And so the 28th Hector and Andrew Stewart Memorial Lecture has now come to a close. We don't have any other announcements? No. The special guests of the Hector and Andrew Stewart family are now invited to accompany Professor Carling and myself and Rosanna to the Science Common Room for a private function. Thank you once again for joining us and supporting the UWA Institute of Agriculture activities over the years. I think there are a couple of more lectures are coming, but generally it has been a very good year. Thank you again.